Welcome to Bookshelf, a series where we speak to scholars and experts on their new books covering South Asia, brought to you by the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. My name is Karthik Nachiappan. I'm a research fellow at the Institute. Today we have the distinct pleasure of speaking to Nico Slate, professor of history at Carnegie Mellon University and the author of Lord Cornwallis Is Dead, The Struggle for Democracy in the United States and India, published by Harvard University Press in 2019. The book offers a sweeping look at the struggle for freedom that linked both nations and how both countries over their history have attempted to manage and deal with democracy and its inherent tensions and contradictions. Professor Slate, welcome.
Thank you, Karthik. It's a pleasure.
I want to begin by asking how you came to write this book. Your previous book, Colored Cosmopolitanism, The Shared Struggle for Freedom in the United States and India, looked at the hidden history and connections between US and India with a focus on activists who worked across borders of race and nation to push both countries toward democratic progress. Did Cornwallis grow out of that book?
Yes, it did. It grew out of that book and also out of a course that I've taught for many years that looks at the long history of connections between the United States and India. Like many scholars, I teach things in order to try to learn about them. And that course taught me a tremendous amount about the history of links between the US and India. My first project, Colored Cosmopolitanism, as you mentioned, looked particularly at the connections between the African-American freedom struggle and similar struggles, both against imperialism, caste, and other forms of oppression in South Asia. But even while I was working on that project, I kept realizing that this is part of a larger story of connection, which is also a story of disconnection. As you said, it's a project about democracy, but it's not a celebratory project, at least not in its entirety, because one of the things that really struck me in my first book, and then again in Lord Cornwallis Is Dead, is just the way that even as these two remarkably vibrant and lively democracies in the making are connected, those connections are often born of misunderstanding. They're often very self-interested. Whether in the sense of nationalistic or even in more limited conceptions of the self, whether we're talking about race or caste or other forms of identity. So it's a project that tries to step out and look at the broad sweep of connections between these two remarkable countries, which are, as you know, often celebrated as the two largest democracies in the world. I want to recognize the achievements of these countries and the way that their histories have helped them both establish those achievements. But I also want to reveal how much remains to be done.
Right. The book is truly breathtaking in scope and canvas, in its grasp of US-India relations, unpacking the many bridges, political, economic, cultural, and intellectual, that have connected both countries. You have chosen to anchor these seemingly disparate strands on democracy. Conceptually, how does democracy lend itself here as a framing mechanism to you?
It's a great question, and it wasn't immediately obvious to me what the framing mechanism would be. I was tempted to use the idea of freedom, which of course is often connected in people's minds to democracy, but they're very different ideas. I was tempted to start with freedom, but over time I came to realize that although there is a tremendous amount of cultural history in this book, there's a tremendous amount of intellectual history, of economic history, that the real heart of this book for me has to do with the relationships between those other strands and the political history that I really came to see as the central defining arc of the narrative. And within that arc, the key goal that I see many different people on both sides of this relationship, the key goal that people are striving for is democracy. And it's not a simple conception of electoral democracy. I actually think that's a really important point, something that I hope people will take from the book. The democracy is not just about having elections on a certain regular schedule. It's not even about the freedoms that we tend to associate with democracies, like freedom of speech, for example. There's a broader reach in the democratic vision of many of the figures in this book. Someone like a W.E.B. Du Bois, for example, or a Tariq Nath Das, or, you know, within the South Asian context, many of the founders of India, right? From Gandhi to Nehru and others. These are figures who are, I'll add Kamaladevi Chattopadhyay, who's one of my favorite figures to write about. These are all figures who imagined a democracy that extended beyond the rough structure of politics to include a more expansive conception of freedom or equality. So I want democracy to be at the heart of the book because I see it as the central aspiration of the characters I'm writing about, but also because I want to help problematize what we understand by the word democracy.
Right. In terms of structure, the book is divided into 3 keywords that form chapters thereafter: Indian, caste, and thug. And I want to explore each word with you further. The word Indian was fraught with significance in the 19th century. Many Americans used the term to refer to Native Americans and Indians from the subcontinent, 2 very different connotations. You write in the book that the word Indian was defined less by its origins than its utility. How was the term used in 19th century America?
It was used in a variety of ways. And it's a great example that I was trying to get at before about how connections can in fact be disconnections or misconnections, right? Because the very idea of Indians in the context of the Americas is, of course, born of a great mistake, one of the most famous mistakes in history, right? Christopher Columbus thinks he's reached the Indies, and thus we have Indians all around the world. That mistake creates a template that historical actors can employ for their own ends. Consider missionaries. Missionaries in the US often linked the so-called heathens, right, the non-Christians within this country, to non-Christians in other parts of the world. And they saw really a fundamental connection between their struggles to convert people that we would sometimes call Native Americans with the people of the subcontinent. So from the perspective of the missionaries, what the word Indian does is it helps facilitate a particular conception of religious hierarchy in which all the peoples of the world that are not Christian need to be saved or salvaged together. But then others will take up that word and employ it in quite a different way. So I mentioned Kamaladevi Chattopadhyay earlier. Someone like Chattopadhyay or like Cedric Dover, who I've written about as well. These are figures who come from the subcontinent to the United States, and while they're here, try to form their own solidarities of resistance between the struggles of Indians in India and Indians in the United States. So what could be and was in the 19th century often used as a form of hierarchy, whether based on religion or race as well, can be flipped and used to create solidarities.
Right. One interesting aspect of this that you bring out of the book was this differed based on geography as well. Indians were treated differently in Western United States and in the eastern part of the United States.
Yes.
Would you like to share more about that?
Oh, yes, absolutely. This is one of the most fascinating pieces of the project for me, in part because I have always had a strong connection to the history of Indian Americans. I think this is a story that has not been told well enough. And in some ways, it's the core narrative of the book. If you're thinking about how India and the United States are linked, well, you have to start with the fact that people linked these 2 places, people who came from the subcontinent to the US. Of course, there's some Americans that go to India, and I write about them in the book. But really, the true significant story is about people coming from India to the US. And when they come to the US, they spread out and they move to all different parts of the country, and they have very different experiences based on where they end up. So on the West Coast, where there's a strong, deep-seated antipathy to Asians of all sorts, right? To people coming from China, Japan, and Korea eventually, Indians get slotted into that general conception of Asia, and they're discriminated against because of it. There's a horrible riot in Bellingham, Washington, which I think some readers will already be familiar with, but many Americans at least have no idea about the history of anti-Indian bias on the West Coast, but it was a tremendous force with tremendous violence. On the opposite side of the country, however, being Indian could be a much more ambivalent situation. So in the South, for example, in the American South, at a time of profound discrimination against people of darker skin, if someone was able to distinguish themselves as being from India, it could actually help them get around, if not entirely, to some degree, get around the racial quotas of that day. And so we even find African Americans who wear turbans and take Indian names in order to try to avoid the strictures of Jim Crow. And the North, New York, Chicago, etc., is kind of in between. And so there isn't the same deep-seated anti-Asian bias that we find on the West Coast. Wearing a turban in Chicago or New York or Pittsburgh, where I am now, would most likely attract some degree of interest and perhaps respect. Whereas on the West Coast, it very quickly became a dangerous thing, right? To wear a turban, it could signal you out for some form of discrimination. On the other hand, there was also anti-Indian discrimination in the big cities of the East Coast. Often Indians were lumped together with African Americans and other people of darker skin. So you see a sort of spectrum of how Americans tried to make sense of these people coming in, people who are sometimes called Indians, but also, here's another interesting wrinkle, they're often also called Hindu, right? Regardless of their religious background. So Muslims, Sikhs, and others are all lumped together as Hindus, which is at times a derogatory label, right? They're attacked, particularly in the West Coast. But also in other parts of the country, there's this tremendous reverence for Hinduism, right? That goes back to the Transcendentalists and others. So it's a very rich history, which I think comes all the way up to the present day. If you look at the role of Indian Americans in the United States today, you see that on the one hand, they're often described as a model minority who have succeeded economically, culturally, and otherwise, and are able to separate themselves from other people of color. On the other hand, they often face discrimination, particularly in the wake of 9/11, and just the generalized fear of dark-skinned others that sadly we're still struggling with in this country. So, being an Indian in this country today is a very mixed thing. Sometimes it can be, an opportunity to distinguish oneself, right, and to rise up economically, culturally. But other times it can also be a real liability. So that mixed legacy is still with us.
Speaking of Indians in the East and West Coast, race was also central to connections and links between both countries in the 18th and 19th centuries. And you vividly describe some encounters which include influential American figures like US President Ulysses S. Grant and Mark Twain, who visited India, and Indian figures like Swami Vivekananda and Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay, who the book is dedicated to, that traveled across the United States. Race was a very vexing issue that both countries also had to confront internally. And these prejudices invariably affected Indian migrants and visitors in the United States. Some Indian figures, like the book's, who features on the book's cover, Bhagat Singh Thind, sought to erase this racial identity gap by seeking to classify themselves as whites. How did race influence and affect India-US ties early on?
Oh, in so many ways. And that's part of the challenge, actually, for us looking back, is to try to parse the many ways that race mattered without assuming that those ways were akin to the way race matters in our world today. This is part of, I think, the challenge of understanding race and racism, is that it's so pervasive in our world and in the past that it's easy for people to think, oh, well, we know that story already. Oh, of course there was racism in the US in the 19th century or the 18th century. Of course there was racism in colonial India. But as a historian, what I think is so important is to track how what race meant, in fact, did change dramatically over time, and also varied based on geography and also based on particular individuals. Right? People were able to find different ways around it. Bhagat Singh Thind is a wonderful example of the complexities. And I was so happy we were able to get that cover on the photo because I love the cover. I think it fits the title quite well as well. Thind is a tricky figure. On the one hand, one could potentially criticize him for trying to separate himself from other dark-skinned people in order to sidestep rather than directly confront the racism of the day. So in his case, the main issue was citizenship. He was a veteran of the First World War, who had fought in the United States Army. Or at least was in the United States Army. He was a long-standing resident of the United States, and he wanted to become a citizen. But the laws at that time stipulated that in order to become a citizen, you either had to be of African descent, that was a legacy of the Civil War, or you had to be a white person. And that was the word that was used, white. And so Thind really had two options. He could either just accept the fact that he wasn't going to become a citizen. Well, actually, I'll say three options. He could have fought to change the law, and that's important. Or he could do what he did, which is to try to convince a series of judges that by dint of his Aryan or Caucasian ancestry, and both of those are very loaded terms, right, which has this long pseudoscientific history, he could use that very complicated, fundamentally racist history in order to try to advance his own claim for citizenship. And that's what he did. And of course, he succeeds, as many other Indians had, at getting judges to certify their whiteness, in part because many racial scientists of the day saw particularly northern-born, higher caste Indians as being Caucasian, Aryan, and thus white. He succeeds all the way up until the Supreme Court, in which this famous case decides that no, in fact, he's not white because the common man would not see him as white, and thus other Indians are not white. It's a catastrophic decision for the Indian American community because now all of a sudden, all of these people that had been granted citizenship were faced with it being revoked. There were deportation proceedings. People that had bought land, particularly in the West, were worried that they were going to lose that land because in California, for example, the law said that in order to own land, you had to be eligible to become a citizen. So there are tremendous consequences to this. One could criticize Thind for not forging solidarities with other people of color and fighting to change the fundamental law. But I'm more tempted to be sympathetic. Even while as a historian, I would do my best just to make clear the facts of the case. I also want to try to convey the realities that Thind and other Indian Americans were living within, and to understand what was driving their struggle, and also to realize that Thind, even in his own way, helped break down some of those boundaries. His case, even though it was ultimately defeated, his case helped raise issues that others were then able to pick up and champion and fight to change. So I think that's a good example of just the complexities of the way that race operated in the United States. In South Asia, of course, you have race, largely thanks to the British, but you also have caste, which is not the same as race, but is in many ways akin. And so Americans coming to India were confronted with a situation that they were very quick to understand as equivalent to racism, but was also in many ways quite different for them. So the complexities create opportunities for people that then become choices, and they have to decide, well, where am I going to stand here? What am I going to fight for? I dedicate the book to Kamaladevi Chattopadhyay and to Polly Murray, these two remarkable women, both of whom decided to try to fight to break down all of these forms of discrimination, to try to create a world in which people could pursue true democracy regardless of their skin color, regardless of their caste, regardless of their gender, religion, etc. That's those are the figures that I'm ultimately most sympathetic to. But the book is full of people like Thind that are more complicated and yet in their own way are fighting, I think, for something important, something worthy.
Well, let's talk about the other issue which you just mentioned now, caste. Caste, a highly loaded term in both the American and Indian contexts. And you very carefully unpack how Americans imported this foreign term or idea as a descriptive and rhetorical tool for various purposes. Now, many people in New England would have probably heard of the term Boston Brahmins, and you talk more about that in the book. You know, American presidents, no less, a figure like JFK, spoke about caste and not importing the caste system within the United States. How did caste intersect with and complicate issues related to race in the United States?
It's a very important question, and one of the strongest links between my first book, Colored Cosmopolitanism, and Lord Cornwallis Is Dead. In Colored Cosmopolitanism, one of the main arguments that I wanted to advance was that the link between the African American freedom struggle and India always operated on two separate but linked axes. One was race empire, right, in which the Black struggle for freedom was equivalent to the Indian struggle for freedom against British rule. But there was also always a separate form of connection, or analogy, if you will, between race and caste. And these two analogies were sometimes used by the same figures, sometimes used by opposing figures. And I carry that forward into this book with, in some ways, an even broader question, which is not just how did caste operate to link the Black freedom struggle to struggles in India, but how did caste operate more broadly within the context of the United States, where people don't usually think about the word as much. And what I found, and other scholars have done this as well, I've benefited greatly from a friend of mine and another scholar named Daniel Immervar, who's written a wonderful article about this. What is so striking to me is that caste becomes extraordinarily common within the American vocabulary and is used in many different ways by many different figures, even to the point where it becomes, in the early 20th century, a kind of standard element of American sociology of race. So there's the so-called caste school of American race relations, which wants to argue and does argue that racism in the United States is fundamentally equivalent to a caste system. And I think the danger of this approach, other than the fact that it blurs both the complexities of caste within South Asia, right? It makes all kinds of assumptions about what caste means in India, which turn out to be completely false. But it also obscures the complexities of race in the United States. And so it becomes a very rigid conception of caste in which there's a strong hierarchy based on race and class, and in which the presumption is that people who are at the bottom of that hierarchy have been led to accept it. That's, I think, one of the most troublesome ways in which caste gets employed to understand race in the United States and in India, for that matter. In both contexts, American scholars in particular come to feel that the people at the bottom of the hierarchy have accepted things when in fact they hadn't. And they come to see that this has been a sort of age-old system when in fact it had been constantly contested and fought against over time. So there's ways in which, many ways in which the use of the race caste analogy are troublesome. However, I also think one of the most striking things for me in really tracing the evolution of the idea of caste within the American context is that there are also a lot of figures who use it in order to pressure the United States and American political figures to change. I mean, so you mentioned JFK, for example, but there are many other examples of activists from below, as well as, political figures at the top, who say, we don't want to have a caste system in this country. That's not who we are, right? I mean, the presumption, of course, is, oh, that's something that those terrible people over in India do, and that itself is very problematic and troublesome. But within the American context, I think it is still used often in an emancipatory direction, trying to force people to confront the degree to which our own conceptions of democracy remain to be achieved.
Right. Fascinating. The book then moves from the 19th century to the 20th century, and some of its key events, like World War II and the Cold War. India's significance to the Allied war effort gave a shot in the arm to advocates pushing for India's independence. Gandhi and Nehru themselves wrote to US President Franklin Roosevelt, who then takes up the cause of Indian independence with Churchill, rather unsuccessfully, I might add.
Yes.
You also very interestingly highlight the role of certain Indian Americans who formed an India lobby to get US support for Indian independence and against imperialism. Now, a lot of us think that the India lobby in Washington, D.C. is a recent construct or event, but you argue that it's not. Now, the United States at that time was also an imperial power with many possessions in the Far East. Did these groups, the India lobby and individuals like Nehru and Gandhi, sincerely believe they could persuade the US government to take up their cause? And how successful were they?
I think they absolutely believed that they could convince the United States to take up their cause. And I don't think they were entirely naive in that conception. Of course, the United States was an imperial power. I think there's a good argument that we still are in our own way, sadly. But the form that empire took varied from direct territorial possessions. I mentioned Daniel Immerwahr. He's got a best-selling book about the degree to which the United States actually had direct territorial control in different parts of the world. But there is also a way in which American empire was conceived of very differently from the British Empire, and in a way that would allow for Indian independence if, and this gets us even further along in the time into the Cold War era, if India would remain open to American investment, to buying American goods, etc. So it's a conception of the relationship between India and the US that has its own colonial ramifications, which of course troubles Nehru in particular and many others on the left of the Indian spectrum. But I think they have reason to think that many Americans could be convinced that getting rid of the British Raj would actually be good for American business, right? And not just a good thing for the world, but also good for American business. I think there were some idealistic drivers of the hope that the United States would live up to its promise as a beacon of liberty and freedom, right? Just as it happened with Wilson during the First World War, right? There's a lot of literature on how in the aftermath of the Great War, many peoples around the world, including in India, turned to Wilson as someone who would champion their cause because he talked so much about self-determination, etc. Similarly, at the Second World War, there's the same hope that Franklin Roosevelt and later Harry Truman and other American political figures will stand up for America's, commitment to democracy and freedom. In some parts of the world, obviously that fails dramatically. In Vietnam, for example. In South Asia, it's more complicated because there is a degree to which the United States and the American government speaks up and tries to pressure Churchill and others to grant India autonomy or some degree of freedom. In the end, it's lukewarm pressure. It's not that important to Roosevelt, and it's very important to Churchill. And so, as you said, it doesn't go very far. But imagine, this is hypothetical. Imagine that the United States had approached the British Raj as we would later approach French control of Indochina, Vietnam, right? Imagine that the United States had poured resources into the British Empire, trying to prop it up in the aftermath of the Second World War, and then had even tried to step in. This was actually one of the worries of people like Gandhi and Nehru. They were concerned that the United States, we had something like 200,000 soldiers in India during the Second World War. I loved researching that history, by the way, because there's so many people don't know about it, and it's so rich with fascinating stories. All these American troops, predominantly in Kolkata and other parts of the Northeast, a lot of Indians worry that they won't leave, right? That the American soldiers are just going to stay, and they didn't. And so I think there is a degree to which the India lobby plays an important role at encouraging American power brokers to see India's freedom as a good thing, as a positive thing. And the key figure, we haven't named him yet, J.J. Singh, there are others that are very important in the India lobby, but the key figure J.J. Singh, I think, deserves a lot more attention than he's received, particularly in the, there's some good work in scholarship. There are several good books on the history of Indian Americans in the U.S. But I think even within the Indian American community today, many people don't know about J.J. Singh and others who really fought both to try to gain India's freedom and to establish the position of Indian Americans in the U.S. And the last thing I'll say, trying to be as succinct as I can here for you, Karthik, the last thing I'll say is that those things were related, and people knew they were related. They knew, going all the way back to the beginning of the 20th century, why were Japanese Americans, before the Second World War, of course, why were Japanese Americans treated better than Chinese Americans? Well, it's because Japan was so much stronger. It's a much stronger country. And Indian Americans took a lesson from that and said, well, we need India to be independent so that independent India can then champion our rights in the United States and elsewhere. So the India lobby in the U.S. was simultaneously fighting for civil rights in the U.S. for people of Indian descent and for the freedom of India. And they saw those two causes as fundamentally connected, as I think they were.
The third and final keyword in the book is thug. Another highly loaded term that comes out of colonial India. What do you mean by thug? And why did you choose this word to frame the last part of the book, which looks at the resurgence in US-India relations, marked by progress on the economic front, characterized by aid in the early decades of the Cold War and trade and investment after the Cold War?
So I'll admit something, which is that I came to thug as the frame for the last third of the book very much in the way that most of my students do, which is that you start with just pure fascination with a remarkably rich and interesting history. The history of that word and of the associated concepts is, I find, just endlessly fascinating. It raises issues of race and racism, of religion, of crime and violence, of empire. As you know, originally the term is employed within the colonial infrastructure to describe what is seen as the secret cult of ritual murderers. And there's still an active scholarly debate on exactly how much of an invention this was. I tend to lean towards the side of seeing it largely as an invention. It's one that certainly, regardless of how true it was, certainly was useful within the infrastructure of the British Raj. It gets picked up in the American context and quite quickly Americanized in a way that it no longer even references India, right? And so you get, in the early 20th century, you get references to thugs without any conception that it references India or anything of India. And that remains off and on true all the way up to the present day, when, of course, it has this heavily racialized connotation in the U.S. It's often associated with African Americans, with, hip hop and rap culture. And yet, at the same time, because of Indiana Jones and other American cultural references, there is also some awareness that the idea of thugs and thuggy has this colonial Indian history. So I found that just incredibly fascinating. But of course, something fascinating doesn't necessarily mean it's that important, and it doesn't mean that it should serve as a frame for a book that's as sweeping as this one is. And so I had to ask myself, is this the right word? And I considered many others as a frame for that last third of the book. And I ended up coming to thug because I ended up feeling that the role of the outsider and of those that are pushed outside the pale of the state, of the society, of the nation, has to be reckoned with in what could otherwise be quite a celebratory part of the book. I mean, this is the part of the book where India gains its independence, where the American civil rights movement, right, borrowing heavily from Gandhi and nonviolence, creates a wonderful series of achievements. And I do want to celebrate those things. I think it's actually really important, particularly for young people in both countries, to recognize just how far we've come. These are tremendous achievements that did owe something to each other, particularly the civil rights movement. Figures like Martin Luther King and many others, Pauli Murray's another one, drew very actively on Gandhi and Gandhian legacies, and other Indians, people like Kamaladevi Chattopadhyay, who come to the US and forge their own solidarities with African Americans. So there's many things to celebrate in this period of time, as are the economic linkages you mentioned, right? There's a success story there in India's economy that has to do with ties to the US, the whole software industry and all these high-tech connections. There are reasons to celebrate all these linkages, but there are always people that are left out, that are left behind, that are pushed out, that are demonized, right? And we can't forget those people. And we can't forget them not only because we owe it to them not to forget them, but also because their story is very constitutive of everyone else's story, right? And so that's why I ended up deciding to frame this in terms of thought, because I didn't want to lose what I see as the fundamental argument of the book, which is that the struggle for democracy in both countries depends heavily on links between them, and those links are flawed, and so the outcome is flawed. So that we get the two world's largest democracies. I think India is a democracy. I think US is a democracy. Ramachandra Guha at one point says India is a 50-50 democracy. And I often ask my students, is that true? What do you think? What percentage would you give? And what percentage would you give the US? I've rarely found anyone that would give either country 100%. Most people can admit that neither India nor the US are perfect democracies. But I think there are also many reasons to celebrate the achievements of both countries. So what I hoped for with the idea of Thug is to convey a sense of the outsider, of those that are pushed out, and also to realize that those people that are pushed out are often those that keep fighting in order to try to improve our democracy for everyone.
Right. Speaking of those that are excluded from these democratic projects, I want to move to the last chapter on film. I imagine the chapter on Bollywood and Hollywood was the most fun to write, and in my case, read. You argue that both Bollywood and Hollywood films reveal the power of connections between both countries, but they also blind us to existing hierarchies and injustices that are unfolding. The progress that are shown by film does not meaningfully capture the fault lines within both societies. How does film help reveal struggles toward freedom and democracy in both countries, and why does it fall short?
It was so much fun to write that chapter. As I said, this book came out of a particular course I teach, which I often call India America, with a dash in between. Slash in between. But there's another course that I've taught for many years called India Through Film, in which my students and I watch a different Indian movie every week and talk about what it says about Indian history and society and culture. And oh, what a fun class that is to teach, because I love Indian movies, as do most of my students, and so it's just a joy fest. And when I first wrote the first draft of that chapter, it was quite a celebration. It was a celebration of the films, and it was a celebration of the way they reveal the many connections between these two great countries. There's so many movies, many of them Indian movies, but also some movies produced in the US that demonstrate and embody in themselves the remarkable history of connections between these two countries. And that itself I find quite beautiful often and moving. But as you said, what I came to realize as I worked on that chapter and I rewatched some of these films and I thought more about what they mean, I came to see that even while they beautifully narrate some remarkable linkages and connections, they all also obscure at the same time. And that, again, returns to the core argument of the book, is that these connections can also be disconnections, they can be misconnections, and they can blind us to the work that still needs to be done. So what I hope readers will take from that chapter, other than just a fun read through lots of wonderful movies, and I do hope people have fun with the book as a whole. I also hope that they're challenged to think about the power of storytelling, not just cinema, but storytelling more generally, as a way to help us celebrate, but also to goad us to continued action. And there are a lot of great films that do this. There are a lot of wonderful films that are simultaneously celebrating these sorts of links and challenging us to go forward. I think about like, Shah Rukh Khan's Swadesh, for example. This is a film that my students love to watch. It's a heartwarming, classic Shah Rukh Khan film. And one that in some ways is a celebration of links between India and the US, the power of technology coming together. But, there's this wonderful scene that you may remember towards the end of that film where Shah Rukh Khan's figure, is confronted by these villagers who argue that, any effort to learn from the US is not respectful of Indian culture and traditions, etc. And he says, no, that, to be a real patriot is to believe that you can do better. And that we should learn from people all around the world that, the United States is not perfect, India is not perfect. And that what we need is for these two wonderful countries, these two wonderful peoples to come together and to learn together and to keep fighting to achieve the country that they want. That's a message that can be celebratory, but I think is also challenging for us in really powerful ways.
Before we move to the last part of our conversation, I want to ask, when you were surveying US-India relations through the centuries, through the lens of democracy, were there issues that you wanted to add in the book but were not able to? I asked this question for a reason. When I was living in Washington, D.C., I had heard and read many stories of how US judges and justices influenced the shaping of India's constitution in the early 1950s. Was constitutionalism something that brought both countries together?
So the answer to both of your questions is yes. Yes, constitutionalism and legal history more generally is an important connecting thread. And it's not one that I was able to delve into in any kind of detail. I gesture very briefly when I talk about Ambedkar and his legacy. But there's much more that could be done there. And there are many aspects of this history that I was only able to just touch on. I came at the project initially with the hope of a certain comprehensiveness. This is one of my faults as a historian, and it is a fault actually, is I like to try to fit everything in. I don't want to leave anything out. And yet, if you're going to tell a good story, and if you're going to have a clear argument, you do have to decide where to draw certain lines. And this is a project, as you said at the outset, it's quite sweeping in time. It starts in colonial area, comes fairly close up to the present. We're looking at political history, history of culture, of economics, of migration. There are lots of different figures. And so I did have to draw certain lines. And my hope is ultimately that what readers will do, as you just did yourself, is to recognize those limitations, perhaps using my notes as a starting point and try to dive further in. I tried as often as possible in the notes to this book to recognize just how many wonderful other books and articles have been written on these linkages or on each country, and to offer my gratitude, because this is the kind of book that, while I did a lot of my own research, I also had to rely quite heavily at various points on the work that has been done by others. And I try to make that very clear in the text, not just as an act of gratitude, but also so that readers who are interested can say, oh, actually, I want to know more about the 200,000 American soldiers in India during World War II, or I want to know more about those missionaries, or I want to know more about Indian Americans in the U.S. South, and then they can dive in and they can read more. So it's hopefully for everyone, it's a starting point rather than an ending point. I actually think that's the best you can hope for a book. You don't want someone to read a book and put it down and think, well, that's all I ever need to know on that subject. That would be boring. What you want them to say is, wow, this has opened up so many other questions for me, and now I can go out and try to answer them.
Right. So since 2000, US-India relations have ticked upward, propelled by increasing convergence on strategic and economic issues. Successive American administrations have invested in India's rise, placing a bet that India could serve as a bulwark against the rising China and Asia. what keywords would a historian writing a book on US-India relations in 2050 use to describe the relationship then?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. My short answer is I wish I knew. I wish I could look forward in order to look backward on our time today. It's impossible to predict exactly how a future historian will look at our time. And that's actually one of the key lessons that I try to take from history is just a certain humility about our current moment. We don't know how others will look at it, and so we should be humble as much as possible. I do think, sadly, that the word thug, the last word I used in my in my framing, would continue to be important to our current moment. If you look even just at how both nations are struggling with COVID-19 and our current crisis, I think one of the things you see is that there are countervailing tendencies. On the one hand, there are many, many people in both countries that are stepping up to the challenge and trying to bring people together in order to confront this remarkable and remarkably pervasive challenge. On the other hand, there are others who are using this moment to try to drive people apart. And those countervailing tendencies have always been in both countries and at the center of the connection between them. So I think sadly, a future historian will look at our time and say, well, they were still struggling to achieve the democracy that had been long promised. One can hope that, I don't know, let's give us in this country, I don't know how many months we have till November. We have an important election coming up, but let's hope that in the next few years we see a real positive turn in the direction that democracy takes in both countries. But if there's one thing I've learned from history, and I know you have as well, is that you can't just wait for that change to happen. It's only going to happen if all of us fight for it. I mean, this is the legacy of Pauli Murray and Kamaladevi Chattopadhyay, is that it's up to us to decide what future historians will write of these days.
In the conclusion, you write, and I quote, "To achieve the full promise of their democratic aspirations, they must recognize the limitations of their democracies, even while continuing to believe in a better future." As we speak, democracies are under stress in both India and the United States. Majoritarian politics dominate while minorities are facing extraordinary pressures to justify their very existence. Some of these nativist impulses also connect both India and the US. Like before, in the history that you so scrupulously document, can individuals and groups reach across these borders to resist these impulses?
Oh, absolutely they can. And they can, we must. We have to. I don't think we have any other option. It's not easy. It's not easy because our lives are full right now, in particular, with just struggling to get by. Many people in this country are struggling to find enough food to eat, and obviously in India the conditions are quite dire. So it's not as if it's easy or simple, and yet I think we're all called to forge these solidarities. And I find great hope and inspiration in the way that many people, particularly young people, are actively struggling to do so. I have many students who are from India. I have many students who are Indian Americans. Just yesterday, I got an email from a young woman who's Indian American, who is a student at another university, asking to learn more about the history of linkages between India and the US, and particularly how those linkages can be used to forge solidarities in our world today. So there are young people who are actively asking the question you just posed, and that I think itself is hopeful, because it's not as if you can say to yourself, well, what we need are solidarities of resistance in order to achieve democracy. Let's just go and do it. It's a process. It's a challenge to overcome the many obstacles and boundaries that separate countries, that separate people of different races, religions, genders, sexualities. But I think what we can draw from the past is a clear legacy in which those boundaries were crossed and were divided. Let's go back to the history of nonviolence. The American Civil Rights Movement demonstrates, amongst many other things, but it demonstrates that ideas can be very powerful and that strategies and legacies of change can be brought across borders in a way that does fight against those majoritarian impulses that you mentioned. It's been done before, so I think absolutely it's been done before. It's being done right now, and we can continue to do it in the future.
Well, I very much hope for that as well. Finally, I want to end by asking what your current projects are, and I see that you've just come out with another book in late 2019 called Gandhi's Search for the Perfect Diet. What is this new book about Gandhi about, and what are you working on after that?
Yes, so the Gandhi book's actually been many years in the making. It's as you know, it's one of the peculiar things about writing and publishing books is that one can, to some degree, choose the schedule of the writing, but the publishing is a much more unpredictable process. And so I started work on the Gandhi book before the Cornwallis book, and it just took me a long time to get it in the right shape. And so both books ended up coming out at the same time. The Gandhi book started, as I mentioned earlier, as a just sort of, wow, this history is so fascinating kind of a project. Many scholars of Gandhi have mentioned his interest in food. There's a couple books that delve in some detail looking at the relationship between diet and his body. But I felt, and I ended up feeling that much had remained to be said about the centrality of diet to Gandhi's conception, not just of his body, but of every facet of his life. His politics, his religion, his relationship to his family were all fundamentally structured by diet. It was a topic that I would argue he probably wrote about at least as much as, if not more than anything else in his life. His books, his newspaper articles, his letters to people, even overtly political letters to people would often throw in references to particular recipes or particular nutritional advice. And it's a remarkably complex story because, as I said, I started off just saying, wow, look at how fascinating this is. I have chapters on his relationship to salt, to sugar, to vegetarianism, to farming, to whole grains. But I eventually came to realize that it's also a complicated and at times dark story because Gandhi's obsessions with food and diet could also be quite limiting. And so on the one hand, I think they reveal the man at his best, particularly his willingness to change, to continue to experiment, to continue to explore. This is a man who was never content with his life. He was constantly challenging himself to grow and to become more attuned to his own values, and I really admire that. On the other hand, he could be quite obsessive, and he could often force those obsessions on others. And his diet really shows both sides of the man. As to the projects I'm working on now, I'm the kind of writer who likes to have a couple different pots on the stove at different points in the project. So if you kind of get tired of one, you can move on to the other, and then you come back, etc. So I kind of have 3 different projects going right now. I have a book that I wrote that's really a memoir about my older brother, who was a mixed race man. His father was from Nigeria. We shared the same mother. He grew up with me in Los Angeles, mixed race African-American man, and really suffered within our racialized society, was the victim of a hate crime when I was 14, and then later died in part as a result of that. And I wanted to explore him and his life and what it tells us about race and racism in this country. So I have a full draft of that book that I'm now working to just pull into shape and find the right publisher for. And I'm currently going back and forth between a project that looks at 7 survivors of the 1918 influenza pandemic. This book is obviously connected to our current moment. It started actually with Gandhi. I remembered, in thinking about our current moment, I remembered that Gandhi had been deathly ill in 1918. And I wondered, was that influenza or was it not? It turns out it's actually quite complicated and interesting whether it was influenza. And then I thought, what did Gandhi make of that situation? What did he make of his own illness? What did he make of the pandemic? And what could we learn from that? So I wrote a bit about that and realized there's a lot to be said. But I didn't want to write a whole other book on Gandhi, even though he's my favorite person to think about. So I turned to other rich and interesting historical figures that survived that pandemic. The American writer Catherine Ann Porter, the British Prime Minister David Lloyd George, the Norwegian painter Edvard Munch, the American painter Georgia O'Keeffe, the writer Franz Kafka, and then the Canadian-American actress Mary Pickford, who is the least famous figure in the book, but in her day was actually one of the most famous women in the world. All of these people fell deathly ill at that time and survived. And so I am writing about what their survival might help us understand about our current moment. That project is actually close to being done. That's the one I'm working on most actively right now. And then I have this really big sprawling book about the American Civil Rights Movement. Mm-hmm. My first book, The Colored Cosmopolitanism, is about the Black freedom struggle. The only part of it is about the classic phase of the American Civil Rights Movement. A lot of it is earlier decades. And I've always been drawn to that movement for various reasons, some familial reasons, actually. And I wanted to write something more about it. So I'm writing a big book about the American Civil Rights Movement that's really looking at the relationship between nonviolence and education within the movement. So there'll be a lot in there still about India, about Gandhi and nonviolence, but also a lot about the way that African-American figures and other civil rights activists used ideas in education to drive the movement forward.
Great. Professor Slate, thank you so much for joining us and sharing more about your book, Lord Cornwallis is Dead: The Struggle for Democracy in the United States and India.
Thank you, Karthik. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you.